In today's video, I want to discuss more stories of World War I stretcher bearers. In my last video on this topic, I would like to add that I'll definitely find more info as time goes on, so there might be more videos on stretcher bearers. But before, if you missed the last video, here's some info. There were only 4 stretcher bearers per company, and so it was often some time before they received medical help. The stretcher could only be rolled for easier transportation, and it's made for lightweight fabric, so it's able to be transported across the battlefield. That being said, let's jump in. Arthur Carbines, I probably butchered that. Before the war, he was a professional pianist from Uckland who used his musical talents to entertain fellow troops after enlisting in 1914. When he landed at Gallipoli, the horrors of modern warfare immediately shocked him. In the account, it says that he was, quote, almost stunned to witness the dead lying on the sides of the tracks and the wounded coming back, moaning and writhing with their pains. Despite enduring heavy combat himself, Carbines became known for his compassion, even throwing water bottles to wounded Ottoman soldiers stranded in no man's land. By August 15th, the Wellington Battalion desperately needed stretcher bearers, and Carbines volunteered after receiving only brief first aid instruction. The Allied offensive to break out from the beachhead around Anzac Cove began on the 6th of August, and Carbines was soon hard at work. The following day, a soldier directed the Wellington Battalion stretcher bearers to the wounded on the foothills. During the Allied offensive, he witnessed that he would describe as pious scenes, short of stretchers, one of thousands of wounded left all day in shell fire. We were unable to get to them till dusk. Hard work getting through the scrub and down the track, bullets whizzing round. Because there were too few stretchers to reach them, the following morning on Chinook Bar, Carbines saw wounded men laying helplessly in front of a trench, and volunteered to rescue them alone. After nearby British troops refused to help, crawling into enemy fire, he tried unsuccessfully to drag the wounded men back. As he climbed back over the trench parapet and panicked, British officer accidentally shot him in the head, killing him instantly. Friends who knew Carbines were both devastated both by his death and the tragic way it happened. A devout Christian, he had once written a hymn line, quote, "And when this short life is done, we'll go live with him in glory." Private Francis Turner, also known as Frank, served as a stretcher bearer with the Cavalry Infantry Battalion at Gallipoli, where the physical strain of rescuing wounded soldiers slowly destroyed his health. Before the war, he was, quote, had been a brickworker for the Christchurch Gas Company. He was 21 when he joined up in 1914, though pretending to be 22. Tanner described the exhausting conditions in letters home, writing that soldiers go to sleep to the sound of rifle fire and guns and wake up to the same music. Constant shell fire, steep terrain, poor food, disease, and endless casualty evacuations wore the stretcher bearers down physically and mentally. The account said, quote, I am just about done, used up, explaining that his knees were giving way while carrying stretchers. Dysentery and infected wounds plagued the men, while flies covered every cut and scrape. Quote, one of his stretcher-bearing parties included Ben Fuller. Poor Ben is about played out with dysentery. We could only get about 50 yards, and then we would have to have a spell, Frank said. Yet, Tanner continued risking his life to recover wounded soldiers near Turkish trenches. During one rescue mission near the apex, Tanner and 3 other bearers crawled into no man's land, hearing a wounded soldier groaning and calling for stretcher bearers. Only yards from Turkish lines. They half lifted and dragged the badly wounded man back while under threat of machine gun fire. Tanner eventually collapsed from illness and had to be evacuated from Gallipoli on October 15th, though he later survived the Western Front. He was permanently disabled from being wounded by shrapnel in 1917. Private Richard Harrison, also known as Dick, became one of Gallipoli's forgotten heroes. through his work evacuating wounded soldiers by donkey across dangerous slopes above Anzac Cove. A quiet schoolteacher from Auckland, serving with the New Zealand Field Ambulance, Henderson inherited the role after the death of a famous Australian bearer, John Simpson's Kilpatrick, known as Murphy. Using a donkey originally meant for carrying water, Henderson transported wounded men from Walker's Ridge to dressing stations several times each day. He later recalled moving through, quote, the hottest shrapnel through the aimed bullets of snipers and the unarmed bullets that came over the ridges. Although photographers of Henderson carrying wounded soldiers became widely circulated, they were mistakenly identified as images of Simpson, helping create a legend of the man with the donkey under the wrong name. Henderson himself received little recognition during the war and quietly continued his dangerous work until August of 1915, when he was assigned as a field ambulance cook. On the Western Front, he began displayed exceptional bravery and earned the Military Medal for Bravery during the Battle of the Somme, after repeatedly rescuing wounded men under shell fire, where it was said that, quote, he had set a fine example to other bearers. Henderson later suffered severe mustard gas injuries and eventually lost his eyesight because of the exposure in 1934, and later died in 1958. William Harold Coltman was born at Rangroom Moor, a village on the outskirts of Bourton-upon-Trent, and baptized at All Saints in December of 1891, 10 days after he was born. Shaftsfire became the most decorated enlisted soldier of the First World War. He served as a stretcher bearer dedicated to rescuing wounded men, a deeply religious Englishman and a member of the Open Brethren Church. Coltman repeatedly risked his life to save others during some of the war's fiercest fighting. During the fighting near Mannequin Hill in October 1918, Coltman later learned that wounded soldiers had been left behind during a retreat. Alone and under fierce and fared fire, wounds, and on 3 successive occasions carried comrades on his back to safety. He earned the Victoria Cross citation, which praised his most conspicuous bravery, initiative, and devotion to duty, noting that he continued treating the wounded increasingly for 48 hours. Earlier awards recognized the same pattern of fearless rescue work. One citation stated that his, quote, absolute indifference to danger had the most inspiring effect upon the rest of the men. Private Bill Manley of the 13th Australian Field Ambulance experienced both the dangers of battlefield rescue and the brutal reality of captivity during the First World War. While working near Poles Woods on the Somme, Manley and 15 other stretcher bearers entered no man's land carrying stretchers and white flags to recover wounded Australian soldiers. As darkness fell and shellfire intensified, the rescue party accidentally wandered beyond the German front line and suddenly heard enemy voices shouting, "Ah, come Englander!" Unarmed and surrounded, the Australians had no choice but to surrender. Initially fearing execution, the men were instead marched through German trenches while Allied artillery shells exploded around them. Manley later remembered believing they would be returned to the Allied lines, only to discover bitterly they were now prisoners of war. During transport through occupied French towns, civilians attempted to throw the prisoners bread, sweets, fruit, and cigarettes, but German guards struck the women and civilians with rifle butts to stop them. The account recalled, "Whilst the French inhabitants were showering things over us, German guards preventing them from as much as possible." He spent 15 months in captivity under terrible conditions, suffering starvation, disease, and repeated beatings. By the time he was released, his weight had dropped from 13 stone to just 6 or 7 pounds, and the damage to his eyesight eventually left him blind later in life. The story of Private A. Robertson and Corporal E. Grice reveals the constant danger involved in simply moving wounded soldiers away from the front lines at Gallipoli. Serving with the 1st Eastern Mounted Brigade Field Ambulance, Robinson was wounded by shrapnel while helping transport another casualty from an advanced dressing station to the beach. Corporal Grice later described the nightmare conditions stretcher bearers face daily, explaining that, quote, "People have no idea what difficulties and dangers have to be overcome in evacuating wounded. Because Gallipoli's terrain was steep and rocky, mechanical transport was impossible, forcing every wounded man to be carried by hand through shell-swept gullies." Grice described how Turkish artillery targeted these evacuation routes constantly. During one journey, shells exploded so close that dirt and brushwood buried both the stretcher and the bearers. Later, as the men tried talking cover beneath an olive tree, the shell burst in it, and shrapnel tore through Robinson's shoulder. Despite being wounded themselves, bearers continued transporting casualties through artillery fire until they finally reached safety. Robinson later wrote home that from Cairo that he had tried to stop a shrapnel bullet, but it was too hot. It went through my right shoulder. His story demonstrates that even far behind the trenches, stretcher bearers and medical personnel remain under constant threat from enemy fire. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more, click the videos on the right and the left. If you have any video suggestions or questions, comment them below. Have a great day.